we've got on one side ICR, Institute for Creation Research, as continuous environmental tracking. On the other side, we've got Answers in Genesis, who has created heterozygosity and natural selection. These are two competing worldviews, two competing visions of how diversity, adaptation of organisms to this world occur within the young Earth evolution framework. Yes, I'm calling it the young Earth evolution framework. So today, what we're going to look at is yet another salvo in the war between young Earth creationists to determine how organisms adapt and respond to their environment. Today we have Institute for Creation Research and Randy Guliuzza, the president, and the spearhead of continuous environmental tracking. I think it's really his brainchild. And he has brought under his umbrella all the members of ICR who seem to be all supportive of this idea. And the entire research focus of the Institute for Creation Research down in Dallas, Texas, seems to be completely turned toward supporting and propping up this idea of continuous environmental tracking. You're wondering, what the heck is continuous environmental tracking, Joel? Well, I think you'll get if you haven't heard of it before, he's going to define it somewhat in this particular article. I'm going to read an article that just came out from Institute for Creation Research on continuous environmental tracking. And we're going to find out what this thing is and how Institute for Creation Research is going about trying to prove their case. We've got all that coming up next. Okay, here we are. We've got this article by Randy Guliuzza, published September 29, 2023, but just released here on November 18th, 2023 on the website. So this was in their Acts and Facts news publication, but now it's come to the website where most of us actually will see it. Continuous environmental tracking, an engineered-based model of adaptation. Randy Guliuzza is an engineer by training. He's got a couple other people that are engineers with his group. And as he's going to argue here, he thinks that we ought to understand organisms, biological organisms, based on engineering principles. Shocker, huh? Right? He thinks that engineering can explain biology. So this is he's written several of these articles. It seems like he's continually writing these types of articles every couple of months in Acts and Facts, and then publishing them on the ICR website and giving talks to try to trump up support for this idea of continuous environmental tracking. He keeps summarizing it, justifying it, and here we have yet another summary justification. So because it is a kind of an overview, it's a good place to start if you're wondering what the heck is going on with this. And I want you to keep in mind the entire time we're reading this article that Answers in Genesis writes very favorably about the process of natural selection as a real phenomena, something that God ordained as a way to select organisms and to adapt organisms to their current environment. That, to Randy Guliuzza, is an anathema. He thinks that's a dangerous thing in young Earth creationists, that we're giving away evolution, right? To we're imbibing evolution if we take in natural selection. Interesting that he says that, because Ken Ham has a whole series about how other creationists are taking in evolutionary ideas, and he calls them young Earth evolutionists, or falling prey to young Earth evolution. And really here it is Randy Guliuzza saying, Ken Ham in Answers in Genesis, you are young Earth evolutionists because you have been taken hold by the power of natural selection by the secularist, and you're taking it in, and you are leavening Answers in Genesis with bad leaven. Okay, so with that in mind, let's start reading. The Institute for Creation Research is engaged in our biggest science initiative in the last 2 decades. You're wondering, well, what was the previous initiative? They had the RATE project in which they looked at how to explain radioactive elements and decay rates and so forth within the context of a young Earth creationist, and they published these huge volumes on it and a whole bunch of papers that are that were sort of like a synthesis of it on their website. Yeah, for the most part, most of us that have looked at that said, yeah, that was a whole bunch of nothing really, and not very good explanations. But nonetheless, that was a big research effort. They raised funds for it and all that stuff. All right, so after that hullabaloo, there's not been a whole lot, noteworthy from the Institute for Creation Research. So they've got this biggest initiative in 2 decades, and it could be our most important undertaking to date. We're working on model organisms and producing literature to build, and I get it, a theory of biological design, TOBD, trying to come up with a new acronym. Theory of biological design. I think we're going to hear that phrase coming out of ICR quite a bit. That will fundamentally change how biological phenomena are interpreted. So this is a grand vision, right? We're going to fundamentally change the way biological phenomena are interpreted. Why is this so important? A theory is a working hypothesis that logically compiles observations about something into an explanation about its origin and how it works. Now, what if you come up with a theory? A plausible theory can actually change a person's worldview. There's that worldview word that I've discussed in the past about the sort of the squishiness of this and exactly what that means. All right, so if we could come up with a plausible theory, I'd say it's more than a plausible theory. You need to have a solid theory, a robust theory. I wouldn't want anyone to change their worldview based on a plausible theory, a possible theory. So why does he use the word plausible? Well, it's because of the next sentence. Darwin's theory moved millions away from the belief in a theistic origin for organisms. And of course, Darwin didn't come up with a reasonable, robust theory certainly in Guliuzza's mind, right? He came up with a plausible theory, right? And obviously that plausible theory changed people's worldviews, right? They abandoned the theistic origin of organisms, right? So, it's like if we can come up with a plausible explanation for the origin of diversity via this new theory of biological design, which is going to be based on engineering principles, then we also might be able to shift people's worldview back to the proper worldview. So, and then here's an example. Henry Morris, right, of the Genesis flood. He modeled flood geology and changed how geological features are interpreted and pointed millions back to a clear understanding of the historical biblical narrative. Right, the Genesis flood, when it was published and has built the modern day young earth creationist movement. Well, that has brought millions of people back to a better understanding or the best understanding of historical biblical narrative. And that was a plausible hypothesis or theory. But where's the creationist theory of biology? That, for instance, models how biological adaptation operates, like it was truly engineered. Now, I want to note here, Henry Morris was also an engineer. He was a hydraulic engineer. All right, so here you have an engineer that came up with engineering principles to explain how flood geology, the idea that the world was covered by a global flood, and that influenced the entire topology of the earth, all the sedimentary and rock. That changed in his mind how geological features are interpreted, and pointed millions of people back to the proper narrative. So now what we need the same thing in biology. We need a proper theory of biology that models how biological adaptation operates. And how is that going to operate? Well, once again, we need to apply engineering principles. It's truly engineered. Biological organisms are engineered as much as the Earth's geology was explained by an engineer. So why is a theory of biological design so urgently needed? First, if creationists and intelligent design advocates say that creatures look designed because they are designed, common thing you hear. All right. Why do organisms look like they have incredible design and amazing complexity because they in fact are designed. Um, then we need a working theory of engineering biology, not just a focus on identifying problems with evolution. All right, I mean, kudos to Randy Guliuzza. He's recognizing we can't just cast aspersions on and try to upturn the opposing theory and point out little flaws. We need to have a replacement theory, a theory that explains all the data better. Now that is to be lauded, right? I mean, that is the way science operates. I mean, if you can take the evidence that we have, the observations of the world today, and come up with a better, more systematic approach to putting all those pieces together into a theory that explains all those pieces better than another theory, then that would be a reason to abandon that other theory and take up the new theory because it provides more value in terms of explaining the data, the observations of this world. All right, so that's first reason, right? We need an actual working theory, not just a here's what's wrong with the other side. Second, ICR's long-standing model of adaptation was only a lighter version of evolution. He's admitting that ICR has kind of just gone along with the ride with all other young Earth creationists, including Answers in Genesis, from whom Ken Ham was sort of born, right? I mean, because Ken Ham worked for ICR originally. But Gary Parker and all some of the older generation of ICR, they took up a model of biological, where did biological diversity and adaptation come from? Well, it came from kinds that were loaded with genetic information by God in the beginning. And then they were selected for, that variation was selected by natural selection after the flood. And therefore, natural selection created all the species. And actually, because the species are each species is adapted to different environments, one would say, or one does say, and many young Earth creationists would use this type of language that natural selection helps to adapt organisms to their environment. This is what Randy Guliuzza is going to say is not happening. I can't promise you're fully going to understand the difference when we're done because it's very unclear to me. Let's just read it, and then you'll see the problem. All right. So again, I want to stress here, Randy Guliuzza is admitting that our model of how species were formed, what's the origin of species, is not really that much different than the evolutionary theory, right? There's natural selection, there's genetic drift, there's gene flow or lack of gene flow, and then there's potentially a few mutations as well involved. And those four mechanisms then combine to generate species from populations that develop into new, different species, even within kinds. And that was a position of Henry Morris, the originator of modern day young Earth creationism, post 1950s young Earth creationism. And so Guliuzza is saying now that he's in charge, nope, we were wrong about that. He's been very forthright about the fact that we took in too much evolutionary theory. We accepted too much from evolution. And so he's on a mission to, purge all semblances of evolutionary theory at all from ICR and to begin brand new and from the ground up develop an entire new idea hypothesis to explain adaptation of organisms to their environment. And so this is radically different than Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries International, the other two big young Earth creationist organizations, who, again, Guliuzza is not saying directly, but he's pretty much intimating that they're too close to evolutionary biology. Finally, all right, lastly, a theory is a framework that constrains how we interpret data and formulate explanations. It guides the questions we ask and what we predict to find. Okay, I agree. Those are good statements. Thus, a theory of biological design is paramount to setting ICR's innovative biological research agenda. Right? If we want to know what we're doing, what we're looking for, how we're going to design our research projects, we need a sort of a framework theory, right? Framework hypothesis, I'll say, to begin with. And then that allows us to decide on what types of things we need to test. Like you have a hypothesis, you need to test it. So let's find some research projects to test that idea. So he is putting it out there that it's an idea, it's a hypothesis, and it needs to be tested. We need to get real world data to support or reject this idea of continual environmental tracking or continuous environmental tracking. All right, so what are their methods then for testing this idea? Theory building begins with field observations and questions. Biological adaptation is central to evolution. Yeah, I mean, the idea of evolution, of change, organisms changing, is that organisms change because the environment is not static. And therefore, for organisms to survive in new environments, they must adapt. They must change, to that environment. So now, what is Guliuzza's plan for explaining the fact that organisms obviously do change? The observation is they've changed, right? From the fossil record, we can see that organisms are not the same as they were in the past, and we can witness with our eyes over the last hundreds of years and thousands of years that organisms have adapted to new environments. So we decided to use adaptation as the first model of our theory of biological design. Yeah, it's going to be a crucial thing to explain. So yes, I agree. Go right for the guts. We observe that when environments change, creatures often rapidly express complex traits that are highly suitable to the new conditions. Now, these are important words that he's using here. Creatures, when environments change, yes, he admits the environment changes, right? Temperatures change, salinity in water changes, the moisture changes, and so forth, right? Climate's changing. He would probably push back against climate change in a really big sense, but he admits that there's going to be changes. Organisms are not living in exactly the same environment all the time, and says that creatures often express complex traits, and this is kind of really important. That he believes that some of the traits he sees changing are complex traits, not simple traits, and that those complex traits are highly suitable to new conditions. And he's going to argue, not here, that natural selection is incapable of generating complex traits, right, for new situations. What enables these organisms to so quickly and efficiently adjust to changing external circumstances? It's a good question. Where should we look to discover how these changes happen? To something in the environment or to innate mechanisms within the organisms themselves? Right. He's going to argue with continual environmental tracking that the organisms themselves have innate mechanisms to sense the environment and then respond to that environment. Like they already have built in to them response mechanisms. So even though they've maybe never seen a particular environment before, they already have built in them not just the sensors for that environment, but the response that they should have to that environment, right? So this smacks a little bit of the idea that the original created kinds were created as incredibly complex engineered things, and they were engineered with a ton of sensors and a ton of programs that would respond, would come on under certain environmental conditions. So all the organism has to do is sense their environment with their built-in sensors, which already existed in the organisms from the beginning, and then they can change their programming to use different programs. But the programs already exist. They're not making new programs. See, that's the idea of like making complex traits. Can't just make a new program to make a complex trait. It has to already exist, right? Whatever seems to appear as an adaptation has to already have existed in the organism itself. They're simply responding to the environment, turning on new switches. This very much of a an original engineer engineering the organism. That's the idea of the design, right? Completely designed to anticipate all the changes that could occur, and all the organism has to do is sense those things. How did this adaptive process originate? Right? Can natural function as an agent sufficient? Can nature function as an agent sufficient in itself? Could nature make these things? Could nature is the environment, but could nature itself actually create the design? Could it make the programs? You know, how could an organism respond with things to adapt themselves, but nature is causing those? He thinks that that's not possible, right? Or is an intelligent agent needed? Building a theory to answer these questions involves the following steps. All right, so he's laying out the research program for us here. Got to start with interpretation. A theory of biological design assumes that creatures are engineered entities. Right? We're starting with an assumption. Creatures are engineered entities. They have a creator that was an engineer. Three major tenets guide our interpretations of findings. There's intentionality. Because there's a creator, the creator had intention, didn't just randomly do things. So therefore, all traits function purposefully. There aren't any random traits, there aren't any unpurposeful traits. Everything about an organism has purpose, built-in design. Individually, they have individuality, sorry. Like all engineered entities, right? I guess a toaster, right, is an engineered entity. Organisms should be studied as discrete individuals, delineated by definite boundaries. Organisms are autonomous agents. Yeah, see, all this discussion of engineering principles involved here. So they're engineered entities, and they're autonomous agents. And they should be studied as discrete individuals. Has he ever studied ecology? Does he understand that organisms are living in an environment with one another, and what one organism does affects other organisms? Yeah, okay, I guess each one is a discrete unit. Of course, if he really studies biology, you find out that almost no organism is a discrete unit, really. That's a very hard thing to define. I mean, there's so many organisms that live with other organisms in symbiotic relationships. So I don't know how you break that down to discrete units. But anyway, internalistic, the operation of all biological functions arise from identifiable control systems innate to organisms. The operation of all biological functions arise from identifiable control systems innate to organisms. I mean, yeah, in some sense, the things that organisms do are derived from their genomes and the instruction sets that they have, and they're innate to that particular organism. See, he and others at ICR, and for the most part, other young earth creationists, don't think that new information, whatever that information is, however you want to define that, which is undefined, they don't believe that new things can be added to organisms, so they can't derive any new function. So whatever they can do is something they already have. It's already innate to them. So they have to contain all that information from the beginning. All right, so we got to move on. Expectations and explanations. Engineering-based, organism-focused assumptions shift ICR to a radically different approach to biology, right, than evolutionary biologists take. How is this? This is necessarily a departure from the status quo, so researchers have to have the latitude to seek accurate explanations rather than rely on mutation selection assumptions. Right? Can't have any of those mutations and then selection from that, right? Because mutations are random, and then selection is somehow selecting random things, and how can that make complex things? I mean, they would be very, very dismissive of any of that as having the capacity to help an organism adapt to its environment. ICR holds that basic biological research is within the domain of engineering practice. How about that for a statement? ICR holds that basic biological research is within the domain of engineering practice. Analyzing human engineering practices will inform research predictions. So basically, they're engineers, and they're going to treat organisms as engineered products. Thus, we expect corresponding system elements between human-designed devices and biological mechanisms performing similar functions. Like how we design things, how we design devices, we can look for similar principles in how we design, which is partly how God designs. Since we're made in His image, we are using the same kind of logic processors, not as perfectly as God and not as accurately as God, but nonetheless we're applying those same principles. We expect that adaptation overwhelmingly occurs through purposeful modifications and not via mutation and broken systems. See, the original systems were perfect. How could they be otherwise in the original creation? Every single part had function. How could something not have function in the original creation? So mutations can only be breaks of things that were perfect and therefore are broken systems. How could you break systems and end up with adaptation? Or how could you break systems and have organisms adapt and survive better in the environment? Right. So that's the mindset here. You can't have all mutations are bad. They break perfect things. How can you create something that is more adapted to the environment than the previous generation? Because we do witness that organisms are, coyotes and wolves are really well adapted for their environment. But he would look at it and go like, well, but they come from a common ancestor. They came from common ancestor. They came from common ancestors on the ark. And that original dog looked very different and wasn't adapted to every single environment on Earth that all canines live in today. And so we observed that there's lots and lots of adaptations in those organisms that you wouldn't look at the original population and say like, oh yeah, they're adapted for really, really cold weather, at least in their appearance now and how they act now, back at the time of the flood. But none of those things could have happened via mutations and natural selection, which is, this that requires individuals dying, because we're going to see that later. Natural selection is a death-driven process, and how could God use that to adapt organisms? Because in His original creation, apparently natural selection couldn't happen, and so natural selection is the result of the fall of Adam's sin, and so only because of Adam's sin in a fallen world are organisms able to adapt. Now I kind of get where he's getting at. I mean, from a creationist perspective, put myself in a creationist's shoes. And this would be my criticism of other young Earth creationisms. I think Guliuzza is completely wrong on this. None of this is going to make sense, except that he kind of does make sense from a young Earth creationist perspective. He's pointing out some of the errors in other young Earth creationists thinking. So he's going back. He's thinking about the original creation and thinking like there can't be natural selection, there can't be mutations. So what is the mechanism for, even after the fall? This is a world that God had planned. He knew about adaptation. He can't believe that God would use a process that came into form because of sin in order to adapt things, to make things better fit for the environment. That's like saying the world got better for organisms after the fall. That can't be. So he's gonna argue that all organisms were already engineered with the ability to do all these things to adapt to any environment that might come along in the future, but not because the environment is adapting them, or natural, or mutations, or the selection they're being selected. It's because the individuals themselves has innate like mechanisms inside, and they decide they're going to adapt to the world around them. I think I'm capturing the idea here, but again, I'm always a little fuzzy as to exactly what they're thinking. I appreciate he's trying to be as clear as possible here, but you get terms like this. We expect that adaptation overwhelmingly occurs through purposeful modifications. Hmm, modifications? Purposeful modifications? I think he means modifications to the organism's expression. Like they have a program and they can switch it and they can modify the eventual expression of genes, which then helps them adapt to the environment. And that's purposeful because God designed the switch because there's a sensor there. And when he knew that if they sensed this argument, they would new environment, they'd be able to flip that sensor switch and then change the gene expression, and then they're adapted to that new environment. But just a note here, Guliuzza is really thinking on the individual level, like individuals sense their environment and they can change themselves, versus populations changing, which is the evolutionary model, a Darwinian model, right? That you have populations that have variation and only some of the variants survive to the next generation. And so the whole genetic thing, right? That certain genes are being more likely to pass down to the next generation. Therefore, they then are better adapted to the future environments. Guliuzza seems to have in his mind that populations change themselves, like the individuals themselves change themselves, and then they have offspring with those changes, and they give those new changes to the next environment. So it's not nature selecting individuals with some, most of them dying and a few surviving and a few have offspring. He sees that as a dirty mechanism because it requires tons of death. And God wouldn't have used a mechanism or designed a mechanism that required death in order to create better designs or better adaptations to environments. The other thing I wonder whether he means here is overwhelmingly occurs through purposeful modifications. I'm still wondering, whether Randy and others believe that maybe God intentionally uses some mutations or causes certain mutations to create new programs. Maybe not radical new programs, but slight modifications. Because I think he's certainly not going to go with the idea that random mutations could at all be useful. Okay, but we're only halfway through. We gotta move through here. But there's a lot of good stuff here. Continuous environmental tracking. Now we're getting to it. Is ICR's engineered based, organism focused, I would even say individual focused model of adaptation. CET hypothesizes that organisms possess innate systems. Innate, they already have them. They're inside, that actively and autonomously track changing conditions using system elements that are similar to those found in human engineered tracking systems. As we research literature and model organisms, we search for sensors to detect changing conditions, if then logical algorithms and output responses in the form of suitable modified traits. Well, I mean, let's see, Dr. Guliuzza, if you study organisms, I would fully expect you to find this. And I think any evolutionary biologist or any biologist, the cell physiologist, environmental biologist, they would expect to find those types of things in organisms. Surely organisms have the ability to sense their environment and under changing environmental conditions, change their gene regulation so they can adapt. Now, the word adapt here, got to be very careful. Individuals can change their biology in some sense. Let's say that's an area in which I have a certain range of things that I can do given my genetics. Somebody else might have a slightly different range because they have different genetics. They have different genes, right? Yeah, I mean, if it gets, even human beings, gets really, really, really cold outside, and you live in a cold area for a long period of time, you thermoregulate to the point where you are more capable of handling those colder conditions, right? Versus somebody who's never been in that cold, right? So we can, but that person, if they've never been in the cold, if they get in the cold for a long period of time, they can also change their thermal regulation of their body, right? They have changes in their physiological system such that they change the metabolism of their body and adapt to that situation. All right, so you say like, okay, yeah, we have sensors, right? We have sensors for those things. Just like if I have light skin, if I go out in the sun a whole bunch of times, I have sensors, right, that say, well, you need to produce more melanin in your skin for protection, right? But if I'm not in the sun for a long time, it backs off of that and takes the melanin out because melanin takes energy to produce or something. There is a response, right? And due to sense, so that's an innate system. Yeah, that's true. But that's not the same kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about a species adapting, entire populations adapting to new environments. These are not equivalent. And we're going to see that in a little bit here. Results. Research findings from our initial test on blind cavefish. So this is what they're doing. They started this little project with blind cavefish. Support continuous environmental tracking. The striking reduction in eyes and skin pigmentation in blind cavefish stand out when compared to sighted surface fish of the same species. Evolutionists claim that these are a loss of functions due to broken genes. Now here's where things go bad, really bad, for Institute for Creation Research. So I've been looking a little bit into their cavefish. They're really looking at one species, the same species. They say it right here. They compared sighted fish. So there is a species that of small fish that has members of the species that live in lighted environments and can see. And there are populations or individuals that live in dark environments that adapt to that darker environment and lose sight or change their pigment, have lighter pigmentation, right? All within the same species. And so there's genetic variation in this species, but there's more than just genetic variation. There's also what I've just talked about, and that is if you're in the sun, you have response systems such that you produce pigments to protect you from UV light. And then if you're not in the sun, you don't necessarily need those pigments. And so your response is to not make any more of that pigment or even withdraw or let that pigment decay, in which case you become lighter. So I would expect any species, all right, something that hasn't diverged into different species and developed enough consistent characteristics that differentiate the two. In other words, they have a shared gene pool. And if they have a shared gene pool, they have the same sensors in them. Even before they did this project, I would predict exactly what they're getting. I don't know how this supports continuous environmental tracking. It's just exactly what it, I mean, of course, organisms continually track their environment. But this is not showing how one species, like one canine, becomes 100 different, very different species in very different environments with completely different non-overlapping characteristics, right? All from a common ancestor that was on the ark. That's the kind of diversity we're talking about needing to be explained by young Earth creationists. This is variation within one species. And this is not genetically based in terms of like heredity, right? They haven't done it, from what I can tell, they haven't done the experiment where they've taken individuals that they have changed. Because what they're doing is they're tossing fish, right? They're growing a population, right? Like all sighted ones that have that started out with pigmentation, and then they're placing some in the dark, right? They're doing an experiment, taking some of those individuals, some of those progeny, putting them in the dark, and they notice that they lose their melanin, and they also potentially some individuals may lose eyesight or not have good eyesight. And they also notice that if they take them back out, the same individuals, after they've been living for a while in the dark and they bring them back in the light, they'll get the skin pigmentation again. I'll say, whoop-de-doo. Honestly, that's my response to that. What else did you expect? I don't like it. That's not at all surprising, right? Changes in at that level, those are environmental responses. Sure, we expect every species is able to track their environment and respond to environments. Now, within limits, right? So what have they observed? They've observed an individual that has modified, right? Is modified as gene regulation in order to change itself, right? And then maybe even change itself back. But this is within one species. This is not showing the kind of immense modification that we're talking about when we're talking about evolutionary modifications. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, like, oh, look, what do evolutionists claim? They claim that these changes that we have observed are due to broken genes. No, what I'm talking about is if you have a species of fish that is genetically isolated from other fish on the surface, and they don't even mate anymore, they're different species, right? And they're white all the time and or unpigmented, and you take them out and you grow them outside, they don't immediately develop pigment, and they certainly don't go from being blind all of a sudden being unblind again, because they have the ability to sense their environment, go like, oh wait, I'm in the light again, so I'm going to make this switch and then I can see again. Or I have completely lost the ability to produce melanin because I have broken melanin genes, like enzymes that are in that biosynthetic pathway, right? That's what evolutionary biology are talking about. They're talking about like significant changes to entire populations such that they have become different species. They're genetically, morphologically different as a whole species. And they have changed and adapted to the environment for so long that they will not just simply change back if you move them back to that other environment immediately. These are temporary within a single individual's lifetime adaptations to the environment, but those adaptations, that's not an evolutionary adaptation, right? That is a temporal individual adaptation, which we all do. All organisms, right, have a range for every characteristic and trait that they can express, right, in their lifetime, right? Some organisms get much larger in some environments than they do in other environments, right? Some organisms are much darker in pigmentation and others are lighter. Some will grow taller than others depending on their environment. Grow something in a lot of, you grow fish, and they're actually doing this. They're growing fish in slightly different pHs and temperatures and so forth. Absolutely. If you grow an organism in a different temperature, it's going to change their physiology over time. And so they're going to grow to a larger size. They might have different amounts of offspring. There's all kinds of things that can be changed that way. But what you haven't done is you might have two fish that are genetically identical, and they're going to look different in two different environments. Just like if you take two identical twins and you place them in different environments, they grow up eating different foods, they're not going to look identical over time, even though they're genetically identical. But you haven't changed their outlook in terms of when they have offspring, the two of them that look different, right? When they have offspring, they're still going to share the same genes with the next generation, which just means the next generation is still going to have that same amount of variability possible, right? That same range of variation, the same range of ability to adapt as individuals to local conditions. So this is I don't know if it's an insincere statement. Maybe it's just they're comparing apples and oranges here, because evolutionists aren't talking about these. Now there are some individuals possibly, or some populations of this particular species that may have actually had some broken genes, but they can still mate, and so they're going to mix those genes and so forth. But it's not. Let's move on. In contrast, the continuous environmental tracking model hypothesizes that these are modifiable traits that may be dialed up and down as needed. Yep. What have you discovered? You have discovered nothing new, nothing we didn't already know and haven't already established and shown many, 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 many times. This is not revolutionary, radical new research. Our work demonstrates that within a month, cavefish can regain pigmentation when placed in simulated river conditions, and surface fish lose pigment when placed in simulated cave water. Wow, that's really amazing. Not. Just not shocking. It's significant to note no fish died. In other words, these changes that they were able to make to themselves didn't kill them. Again, not surprising. Like, I get darker skin when I am in the sun a lot, and then it gets lighter in the winter. And guess what? I didn't die. It's like, yes, I can do that. My body can physiologically react to the environment and make changes to my skin pigmentation. And I didn't die, right? They didn't die either. Studies on eye modification will start soon. We'll go to that paper real quick, but let's just finish this up. So what's the impact of this research? I would say zilch. No impact. They have not discovered a thing. And this is not anything that is actually contributing to, at least in any short-term sense, to the ability to what we see in terms of adaptations that species have compared to other species. Our fish results already show the power of an engineering-based model. Okay, I'm not seeing it. To prompt a new world of research questions we would have otherwise missed. You didn't miss anything. We already knew all that. What you missed is reading the literature, apparently. Actually, what you missed was taking a really good genetics course, an advanced genetic course, and really learning about gene regulation, right? And learning about all the different systems for upregulating, downregulating, and sensing the environment. Freed from the shackles of Darwin's death-driven selectionism. See, there it is. Darwin's death-driven selectionism. You see, how does adaptation happen in the Darwinian perspective? As I said before, you have to have a, what happens is individuals don't adapt, right, to create new adaptations for the species. Now, I'm using the word adapt differently here, right? I don't consider me getting a tan as an adaptation in terms of changing the species, because we all have that capacity, right? Already, those are just characteristics that we have, ranges of abilities that we have given our genetics. Those aren't new adaptations. But what Guliuzza is saying here is, he's saying the only way that what Darwin requires is that you have a group of individuals, and the only way that change happens is that some individuals are better fit for that new environment because they happen to have mutations, genetic differences in their new genes, right? Or new variants of genes. And then those individuals survive and have more offspring and are overrepresented in the next generation. And the ones that don't have those changes, right, those particular variants, are underrepresented in the next generation. So if the environment changes, all of a sudden there's like some people have, some individuals in a population have just the right combination and they survive, and then therefore the next generation is more like them. And we'd say the next generation is better adapted, right? That's the adaptation. Guliuzza is like trying to say, like, but that requires death. That requires like all the other organisms who didn't have those characteristics to die, and it's only the ones that end up living, right? The lucky few, survival of the luckiest somehow, right? Well, you'd say the environment selected them, but they're the ones that survive. And so there's lots of death involved. And the only way you can make this progress in terms of changing organisms adapting is you require lots and lots of individuals to die, or at least not reproduce. And so that to him can't happen. What he's saying is every individual changes, but I think he's going to admit that some individuals can't sense, maybe don't sense the environment right, don't make the switch, and so they don't change themselves. He still has to have a mechanism to pass that to the next generation. So really, this is Lamarckianism, right? This is uh, inheritance of acquired characteristics. Somehow the individual senses, oh, I'm in a new environment. I've got to start these. I got to use my sensors to then change my gene regulation, or even change which genes I'm using. And then when I have offspring, they'll also be able to do that. So the whole population can kind of adapt itself, all the individuals. And then they create another generation that all has that new adaptation, right? Or inherits that new set of combinations of how they function. We no longer need to force fit Darwin's thinking into the Bible by looking to the fall and the curse to explain adaptation. This is the core right here. This is the difference that Guliuzza sees between what he's doing and ICR is doing and what Answers in Genesis is doing. Answers in Genesis is force-fitting Darwin's thinking into the Bible because what do? They look to natural selection, right, as a causative agent of selecting organisms for survival and reproduction, which therefore means they're selecting other organisms to die in the way he views it. And so it requires death, and death is the result of the fall. So, AIG's mechanism requires sin in the world to function. And he doesn't think there should be a sin function to adapt organisms to make them better fit for their environment. By seeking the Creator's originally designed purpose and mechanisms for adaptation, a new perspective opens that sees creatures as active, problem-solving entities. I got a problem here. And you see, it's an entity and it's an individual. I got a problem here. There's too much salt in the water. I used to be in the fresh water, and now there's like more salt here. And so I am going to adapt to that situation. I'm going to problem solve, right? I'm actively myself going to generate a new way of living in salt water and change myself so I can do that. Darwin says there's a million fish in a population, and the water gets a little bit saltier, and 900,000 of them can't handle that amount of salt and die. But 10% of them just happen to have a slightly different set of alleles, genetic variants, due to mutations that have occurred in the population. And those mutations happen to cause a few genes to regulate some proteins, or actually transport salt transport channels or something like that, and they can pump their salt out a little bit better out of the cells and osmoregulate better and can survive in the salt. And then so they are the ones that survived, but it's only because of the mutations they had by chance. And all the other ones died, right? They just weren't lucky enough to have those mutations. For some reason, Guliuzza just thinks that can't happen. God couldn't really design a system that used that mechanism. And so he seems to think that all the fish would simply, like, God must have programmed them all with the ability to adapt to that, like, increased salinity, and they would all just magically change different switches, or like maybe God would add something to them or change them somehow so they would all individually adapt to that new environment, not requiring any death. I mean, death of course happens, but that's the result of the fall. But it's not a mechanism for selection. Death isn't a selector factor. That's where nature is now selecting for individuals to survive and others to not to survive. They detect and solve very challenging environmental conditions through their spectacularly engineered innate capacities. he views natural selection as a force out there, as if evolutionists think that it's like some kind of supernatural force. It's like instead of God, we've got natural selection. And so he runs away from natural selection, any suggestion of natural selection. And if you think about natural selection very long, or some simple cases of it, it's just so hard to understand how he thinks that natural selection is not a viable explanation for how organisms change over time. It boggles the mind, but he doesn't. Real quick, let's go to this other paper, because this was the paper where they're testing it. All right, so what did they actually do? Well, they have this model animal, right? The Mexican tetra. It's a freshwater fish with two morphotypes: eyed surface-dwelling fish, and with distinct pigmentation, and eyeless cave-dwelling fish with minimal pigmentation. So just by from my perspective as a biologist who studied a lot of species and species delineations, to say that there's a species that has both, it's really interesting that there's a species that has two morphotypes, sighted and unsighted. All right, that's like saying there's two alleles in the population, two variants in the population. And yet those two fish, if you bring them together, right, in a common environment, they can mate with each other and have offspring. And so they would like have a gene that results in sightlessness or sighted ability. It's kind of like blue eyes and brown eyes, right? You can have a population that's all blue eyes, another population that's all brown eyes. You can say there's two morphotypes, but those people can still interbreed, right? And they have offspring that some of them are blue and some are brown, right? And here you have ones that can't see, ones that can't see. And more pigment, less pigment. So they're focused on the pigmentation thing. We've exposed fish to treatments with a diurnal cycle of full spectrum high intensity light. All right, so put a bunch of fish where there's a lot of light. Take fish that with minimal light and low oxygen, and deionize water. Responses of experimental fishes to treatment are directly comparable to untreated stocks of surface fish and cavefish. All right, so they also sampled adult tissues to detect biochemical, neurological, and genetic patterns of expression and regulation. Okay, I expect there's going to be some changes in regulation. You expose them to different environments, you're going to change how the genes are used in those. All right, so what are their preliminary results? Cavefish increase the amount and distribution of melanin pigment across their bodies when exposed to artificial sunlight. Yep, just like I do. Cavefish exhibit behavioral and physiological tolerance to low pH and low oxygen. Well, if you grow them in low oxygen, yes, they're going to change. Right? And they have some tolerance to it. Okay, what they mean by tolerance is like, oh, look, you can change the pH and they tolerate it. They find ways to adapt to it. Surface fish decrease pigmentation across their body and labor during respiration in low pH and low oxygen. Oh, wow. If they don't have much, if they have low pH and there's a low oxygen in the environment, guess what? They have low amounts of energy. When you have low amounts of energy, you can't expend extra energy on making pigmentation, which requires extra energy. So that's not too surprising of a result. If you returned them back to a higher oxygen environment, they probably are going to upregulate and make more melanin. Right? These are just all physiological changes that are within the normal parameters of like the genetics of the organisms themselves. Right? And the fish that live in environments that are dark versus light, because they're still genetically similar, they're going to have that same capacity to be able to modulate between these two. Right? We're not seeing evolutionary adaptations here. Seeing individual adaptation, which is different. Cavefish and surface fish respond to treatments within weeks of exposure. All right, it only takes a couple weeks to get this change, but then they change back. Right, it takes a couple weeks to change them back, so that's not a permanent change. But there are lots of different cave organisms that have completely changed, right? And they are different species than their sister species that lives on the surface. And when you bring them out of the cave, they don't, it doesn't matter how many weeks you grow them out of the cave and you propagate them and even grow generation to generation, they don't suddenly become pigmented and become like their cousins on the surface, right? They've changed genetically so much. They've lost the ability to be able to find that much variation. Yeah. We're not surprised to find animals are adaptive to specific conditions with contrasting environments, but yeah, nope, I'm not either. The CET model predicts a multi-system integration of molecular, biochemical, cellular, physiological, and behavioral modifications across the whole organism. Oh, so they predict exactly what any other biologist would predict. So why is the CET model special? This model also predicts multicellular organisms can modify the course of their development. Epigenetic changes are heritable across multiple generations, and common traits will be observed among the diversity of organisms living in similar environments. Again, what have you discovered that wasn't already known by any other biologist? And these predictions are testable. I would fully expect them to be testable. Thus far, initial experiments results indicate that Mexicanus may undergo relatively rapid transitions between surface and cave environments, suggesting that adaptive traits in these fish and other animals are reversible. Well, some are reversible, yeah. Rapid and reversible adaptations are not explained by any Darwinian models of evolution, an absolutely 100% false statement. Yet, prior to formulation and testing of IRC's innovative CET model, there had been no formal efforts by creation scientists to directly refute the mutation selection paradigm through experimentation with live animals. I suppose that's true, but it's like that's you haven't refuted it at all. You're not actually even really testing it, because you're not really testing mutations and selection to see what they're doing. You're simply testing whether organisms have the innate capacity, individuals have the innate capacity to respond to their environment, which they do. Accordingly, we have initiated a new direction of experimental science for ICR and creation science that sees every organism as divinely engineered creation with adaptive capacity across multiple environmental conditions. Our research aims to confirm that life is thoroughly and intentionally prepared by the infinite wisdom of our Creator, in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. That's not any different than saying that God has provided mechanisms for organisms to adapt and change in their environment. Right? And any mechanism you find could be said to be something that God has created and is part of his divine plan. I have no problem with that. CET, I don't think is the one. All right, that's not going to be a very effective mechanism. For one thing, it's very unclear exactly what the mechanism is. I find this whole continuous environmental tracking thing really intriguing. I think to me, it's difficult to understand what is exactly unique about it. Like, and how do they really think that major adaptations occur? I think Guliuzza thinks major adaptations don't happen because that's only something that evolution, says happens, and we don't really believe that happens. But honestly, you got to explain something more than variations in a single species being able to, respond to their environment, right? That is not the formation of new species. And that's really the major mission here, should be like, how are new species formed? All right. Are they formed? New species are formed by continuous environmental tracking? Where is that? Because what Answers in Genesis is saying is the mechanism of natural selection is the mechanism that is driving populations to be different in different environments, resulting in what we identify as different species. So ICR, what makes two species? Like, where did wolves and coyotes come from? You're saying it's continuous environmental tracking? How so? I don't really get it. But I am fascinated with this back and forth, and really what Guliuzza seems to think, and I think I Answers in Genesis probably thinks so too. I think, well, I know so. I mean, we've had articles written about why each one is completely wrong. And if you read them, they're both have their points, right? But I'm on Answers in Genesis side here. Continuing environmental tracking makes no sense. And it makes no sense to say that natural selection doesn't exist. It just doesn't make any sense to say that when it's as plain as the nose on your face that natural selection happens and has influence on populations over time. Putting Guliuzza, putting all of his eggs in this basket seems to me to be a very dangerous strategy. If he does not convince people outside of the Institute of Creation Research that this is a valuable research effort, the donations are going to dry up even more than they are now to ICR. And they're going to be in great danger of being lost as an organization. Because I don't see them winning over anybody at this point. I don't see other people gravitating to continuous environmental tracking. In order to do so, they pretty much have to turn on Answers in Genesis and other organizations and say that they're rowing upstream and they're falling for evolution. And I don't see young Earth creationists coming out and pouncing on Answers in Genesis in that way. So this is a great rift in young Earth creationism right now. The efforts to try to explain how in the world two animals could step off the ark and become 50 different clearly identifiable species living in highly contrasting environments is one of the great challenges that faces young Earth creationism today. All right, let's stop there. Thanks for hanging out, and I know this is a enigmatic, bizarre backwater of young Earth creationism, but I think it's a really important issue. It certainly has got the potential to be very divisive. All right, let's quit there. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.